If you want to keep your muscle mass high and your body fat low as you get older, there are 3 changes you have to make, and they all kind of suck. You have to increase your protein intake, you have to decrease your total calorie intake, and you have to work out harder. So all these things were changes that I really had to do as I was getting older, because when I was younger, things were a lot easier. I ate a shitty diet, which also probably wasn't very good in terms of long-term health, so I'm kind of glad that I changed that, but it's a bit more effort now, of course, right? I don't really eat pizza anymore and all the things that I used to eat when I was younger, donuts and all those sweets. Again, when you're younger, it's much easier to burn these off. It's much easier to still work out reasonably and gain muscle mass and stay lean, even with a crappy diet and a crappy lifestyle. But as you get older, that's getting significantly harder. So again, the first thing is increasing protein intake, and that's actually very important. As we get older, our absorption of protein really goes down, and the way we utilize protein also changes. So it's important to really meet protein goals, and the older you get, the more important this really becomes. So my goal is always 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. Now, of course, if you have any medical condition where you have to monitor your protein, don't do that. Ask your doctor, right? But otherwise, 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight, right? So if you weigh 230, but your ideal body weight is 180, obviously it's up to 180 grams of protein daily from good sources, right? And what we're talking about here, there could be, chicken, beef, of course, all those are great. Then you can have, of course, whey protein powder. I use a whey protein isolate for about half of my protein needs for the day. I mix one that has a vanilla flavor, which tastes good, with one that is a raw grass-fed whey, which tastes horrible, but I mix them together and they still taste fine. And that actually is about half of my total protein intake for the day. So this is important to realize because, as you get older, to keep muscle mass, you have to have a higher protein intake. Make sure you hydrate, of course. Taking too much protein in without sufficient hydration might be hard on your kidneys, of course. But as long as you do that, as long as you hydrate, as long as you're healthy, then I think this intake is very important. And most of us don't get that. Most of the people that I work with, they take in a very small amount of protein per day. I mean, it's really one of the things that significantly impacts their muscle mass. And as we get older, keeping muscle mass is very important, because one of the things you see, especially when people get to the age of where they're over 70 or 80, when their leg muscles become weaker, walking becomes difficult, people start to fall, they end up in a wheelchair, and then it's really downhill. So really keeping muscle mass as you get older is hugely important, and it's absolutely doable, but you have to go through the right steps. And again, protein is a very important one here. Other sources, of course, besides that is eggs. I have about 3 or 4 eggs every day. And then you can have Greek yogurt if you tolerate that. Some people don't do well with milk products. Some cheeses, keep in mind there's a lot of fat in there. You don't want to have too much of that really. But again, those are the basic proteins that are really good. If you're vegetarian or vegan, it's a bit tougher. I mean, I would say pea protein is my favorite then when it comes to plant-based. Keep in mind, plant-based proteins will have more heavy metals, will have more contaminants in there. A lot of times these things are sprayed with glyphosate or other pesticides and herbicides, so it's a bit tricky. But in general, that's a good goal, 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight. And this is a huge step in the right direction. Also keep in mind, what do we see when people cut down their protein too much? You think of all this Ozempic craze right now, these GLP-1s. When people lose weight on these GLP-1 agonists, 50% of the weight usually is lost in the form of muscle, and this is actually terrible. This is a very bad thing. This also can lead to cosmetic issues like Ozempic face. That's one of the things where we see a real fast weight loss in the face, and there's also some muscle deterioration there. So this is not a good situation, right? So make sure you get your protein in, right? Then total calories. Yes, this kind of sucks because another thing is as you get older, your metabolism does slow down. I mean, again, this is not like a hypothetical. It does make sense. So our mitochondria work better when we're younger. We can do certain things, and I've talked in other videos about this, how to boost mitochondrial health. But mitochondria in general, as we get older, they also become less functional. ATP production slows down. And when you think of our energy expenditure, about a third of the energy production in the mitochondria and ATP production goes to heat. So we really have a high metabolic rate when we're younger, and that slows down significantly. The other thing is we become more sedentary, whether we like it or not. When you're younger, you just run around more, you do more, you're more active, you have time to do things, you go out with your friends on bike rides and all these kind of things. When you get older, you're married and you have children, these things slow down. You always think you do a lot and you do stuff with your kids, but it's not the same energy expenditure that you usually have if you do an intense workout, right? We also become a bit more complacent, we're a bit lazier. It's easier to sit on the couch and watch a movie. When you're younger, you have more of that drive and energy to go out and do stuff. So that's important to realize. So we're less active, we're more sedentary, we might have aches and pains that prevent us from doing more of these aerobic exercises, especially. So we are expending less energy at the cellular level. We're also expending less energy, so our metabolism slows down. So our total caloric intake should be decreased. And that's something I had to really come to terms with, because when I was younger, again, I could eat carbs and all these things in larger amounts without any issues, or even fat like donuts and whatever. But of course, besides that, this stuff is not good at any age. When you're younger, it doesn't affect you as much in terms of your body fat percentage and your muscle tone, but it certainly is not good for your health either, right? So now I'm cutting those things out. I'm sticking with about 100 grams of carbs a day. Again, my protein intake is about 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight, and then carbs around 100 grams a day. Now, what is that? I always talk about this. It's very easy for me. I have about a cup of mixed fruit, like strawberries, blueberries, usually frozen. I put those in my shake, right? And then I have maybe a half a cup of cooked rice, something small like that, maybe a slice of bread, maybe a couple of rice cakes, and maybe a flour tortilla when I make my lunch. So I make a burrito usually with chicken and some beef, and then some cheese and other stuff in there. But that tortilla has about 25 grams of carbs, so that's certainly one of the other sources. And if you count that together, that's roughly 100 grams. You can go plus minus 10, 15. That doesn't really make a big difference in my opinion, but fairly clean. Again, the tortilla, not the greatest, right, because of the grains. But sometimes also you make compromises in order to have a meal that you actually like, right? But if you stick to roughly 100 grams of carbs a day, that is a good step in the right direction. Most Americans, when we have our normal diet, standard American diet is about 250 grams of carbs a day, which is way too high in my opinion. And these are also carbs from bad sources, right? You want to have carbs ideally more from single ingredient sources, right? So that's about the right goal. The other thing in composition on total calories is fat. Now, again, fat is fine. It's very essential. Again, protein and fat are the essential macros that we need. We don't really need carbs. We do make efficient sugar through gluconeogenesis. But again, I think eating some carbs is beneficial. Some people, of course, do well on a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet, but that's not really for the broad masses. It's a bit more tricky to stick to that. And there might be some caveats there as well. I've seen some people do well on those. There's no question. I have nothing against those diets. I think that's fine. But for the majority of people, it might be one, it's very boring, it's very one-sided, and then the other thing is it might be hard for daily energy, it might be hard for mineral absorption and all these things. So there's some caveats there. So 100 grams, I think, is very fine. Then fat. So again, keep fat around 60 grams a day. I usually get fat mostly from the foods that I'm eating. There's fat, of course, in meats. Chicken breast is very, very low, but then beef will have some, of course. Eggs will have some fat. And the fat I'm adding in usually when I'm cooking is either avocado oil, olive oil, or butter, but very, very small amounts. And I'm really trying to monitor that better. One downfall that many people have is when they're cooking, they're just pouring the oil into the pan, right? And you lose track, right? Keep in mind, again, fat is very calorically dense. You're talking about 9 calories per gram, which is significantly higher than the 4 calories per gram you have in carbohydrates and protein. So there's a big difference there, right? So fat, calorically very dense. You want to really monitor how much gets in your diet. And again, some products will naturally contain fat. Just keep a count of that, right? 60, maybe 80 grams maximum, because otherwise you're going to go to very high numbers, right? And again, when you're cooking, then low amounts are usually fine. And then when you add cheese, keep in mind cheese will have some fat as well. And when you watch bodybuilders prep their diet, they eat very little fat. They use a spray of Pam, which I wouldn't agree with. I think that's not a great thing to use. But you can see how they're very much monitoring their fat intake in order to stay lean. Now, I think that's extreme. Again, fat can be very useful. Good fats or animal fats are certainly fine. Saturated fat, don't be scared of that. But your total fat intake should be on the lower side. And that's the way then to really control your diet, right? Because the protein, you need to have that on the higher side, right? So for me, I'm between 180 and 200 grams of protein. That's usually what I go for in my diet, right? 200 grams of protein is already 800 calories, right? And then you add in the 100 grams of carbs, plus minus, and then 60 to 80 grams of fat, right? So this is one way to control the total caloric intake. And that certainly weeds out processed foods. You shouldn't have those at all, especially when you're older. We're talking about donuts, we're talking about fried things, we're talking about, pizza and all these things. Usually this doesn't do you any favors. There's a lot of stuff in there you don't want. There's a lot of bad oils in there. There's seed oils in there and other things that are not very good for us, right? So the third part is training harder. And again, when I was younger, it was much easier to gain muscle, pretty much just looked at a dumbbell and kind of gain muscle. Now I have to really work hard at it, right? And the intensity has to go up. The question then is, Did we have more intensity when we were younger versus when you're a bit older? That's a good question. It's hard to really answer, because when you really think back to your workouts, were you more intense? You're probably working out more with your buddies at the gym. You're pushing each other more. Now I work out by myself. I have a little gym in my garage. That's pretty much it, right? But still, the intensity needs to be there, because you can go through motions of working out. You can do your 10 reps, put the weight down, and might keep some muscle tone, but you're not going to make any gains there. And as you get older, there is muscle atrophy, and that's not sufficient, unfortunately. Now, you want to avoid injuries, especially as you get older. Your risk of injuries goes up. So I always recommend to do at least around 10 to 12 reps, but really, really push yourself. That means you do 1 or 2 sets warming up, kind of going through motions, and then 1 set where you really go close, or as close as you can, to muscle failure. But this should be at least 10 to 12 reps. I would select the weights that you can get to that point. And then you take a lighter weight on your last set and you keep going. You do another 10 reps, right? Until the muscle is really fatigued, until you really exhaust that muscle. And most people don't do that. We become complacent. We run through the motions and we're like, well, I'm going to the gym, but for some reason it's not working. I'm not gaining any muscle. I'm actually losing muscle. Yeah, it's because you're not really working out with the right intensity. And that needs to go up as you get older, because it's, the muscle needs more stimulus to respond. So it needs sufficient protein, right? Which we talked about in the diet part, but also you need to work out harder. And that's something that is most people are neglecting that, and really getting into pushing yourself in the workout, pushing yourself close to failure in the last set is very important. And then, of course, recovery periods. I find now that I have more time between my sets. I used to do, 1 or 2 minutes only rest. I rest more, like maybe 3 or 4 minutes, right? You got to find out what works best for you there. And then in terms of exercises, I do about 3 to 4 maximum exercises per muscle. And initially, I might do 3 sets for the first exercise, 1 warm up, 1 getting a bit more feel for it really, and then 1 really hard one. And then we just do 2 sets, right? You do 1 where you're changing exercises, you go through motion, feeling it out, making sure you're warming up the muscle again in that particular exercise, and then you push yourself. So that working set should really get you close to failure. And then the question is, doing additional sets close to failure, will that be beneficial or not? Because there is a point, of course, when you're overdoing it, right? And then you can also cause muscle breakdown. You can be from an anabolic to a catabolic state, which is not a good idea. So you got to find out what's the right volume of training, and that might slightly change as well. But 3, 4 exercises per muscle usually is fine. And again, going with intensity close to failure, that's really the trick. So again, it sucks getting older, but as long as we understand what parameters change, we can compensate for that, because you want to keep your body fat low, especially the visceral fat. And this is not just so you look whatever better when you go to the beach, but that you really are healthier. It decreases risk for heart disease, cancer, autoimmune disorders, all those things when you have low visceral body fat. That's the fat around the organs, right? And that certainly will also translate into being slimmer in your midsection, right? Clothing fitting better, and you have more energy, and you're feeling better, right? It's very important, actually. And you want to keep muscle tone. You want to keep muscle mass as much as you can, right? Because as we get older, there is muscle atrophy. And that is actually one of the things that's a real big problem later, especially as it comes to the muscles of your legs. But also overall, you have more injuries when you have less muscle mass, and you're aging faster with less muscle mass. And again, less muscle mass is also a predictor of a shorter lifespan. So you want to keep your muscle mass as best as you can, and really work out to the intensity where you can do that, right? So these tips are really, I think, very helpful, especially when you're over 40 or over 50. And in order to really keep muscle mass and keep your fat low, I think these are 3 very simple truths that we can easily follow, and I think makes a huge difference in your long-term health and longevity.